Hi, my name is Alan, and this is the podcast, Matinees on Main Street. This is the history of the movies, and I'm going to tell this story from the beginning. That's because I think history is best told if you look at it chronologically. I'll talk about the people who first invented the process as well as those who helped the industry grow. And I also want to include the people and places that showed them, and even take a little time to talk about the people who watched them. There are also several larger themes that will be included in this story. One of them is the influence of popular culture in much of what happens. Another involves all these people who come in and out of the industry. They all have their own lives, but there is also a larger story that figures in there somewhere. This is also a story about a massive entertainment industry that started from nothing. And when I say nothing, I'm not speaking in a figurative kind of way. I really mean that it started from nothing. It's one of the things that fascinates me about the movies as well as the business that supports it. Just about every other important industry that we know of had at least one person with a twinkle in his eye because he believed in the industry's future. Long before we were making telephones or cars or computers, there were people who knew that they could get wealthy pushing that stuff. But I can't find one person in the late 19th century who had the vision to see how much money could be made from the movies. Sure, there were a few of them with short-term views. They figured that they could make money cashing in on a craze for movie-making machines. But every single person at that time saw the movies as a kind of 2-year novelty, kind of like the pet rock back in the 1970s. And when I say every single person, that includes all the inventors, investors, people who were selling the machines, the guys running the projectors, the men who owned the vaudeville houses, the reporters writing the stories, and even the people sitting in the audiences. Besides starting from nothing, another thing that surprises me about the beginning of the movies is how much the people really liked them at that time. But in the beginning, no one really thought anything special would come from those film clips that were shown during the first few years. So it's quite surprising when you read how thrilled people were to see such simple things as 40 seconds of waves splashing on a beach, or a silent film clip of a marching band in a parade. And still, no one thought that maybe an entertainment industry could rise from this kind of entertainment. When the film historians in the 1910s and 20s were looking back at the beginning of the movies, they could see some of the patterns that the people from the late 1890s couldn't. They noticed how the movie business was similar to the record and the phonograph business when it first started. They also noticed how some of these early movie exhibitions were similar to the other types of exhibitions shown during that time. Those other types of shows were long gone, but in their time they had some influence on the success of the movies. Also, back then, there was a sense that people underestimated the movies, until it became so huge that you couldn't ignore it. Then there were those people who were afraid that the movies had too much influence over our culture. But there was even more who liked the movies just as they were, so a kind of battle played out between these two sides. Everything seemed to change once the business became big. Expectations were placed on the industry and the movies themselves, and from that time on, the movies started carrying our cultural burden. What do I mean by that? Well, somewhere a long time ago, before I got interested in movie history, someone, and I can't remember who it was, said that the movies were really America's only real art form. What did that person mean by that? Probably that traditional art was more of a European thing, while the movies, which were created in France just as much as they were created in America, had its greatest success in the New World. In the 1600s, when artists like Rembrandt and Caravaggio were painting, America was simply small groups of people trying to build small villages out of wood along the edges of America's vast forest. And in the 1700s, as European art started to change into a culture defined by academia and the Enlightenment, America was simply a small collection of towns on the western edge of the Atlantic Ocean, where they carried on the business of international trade. While European artists were painting large historical canvases for kings and dukes, we had poorly trained itinerant painters living hand to mouth as they traveled through the colonies and early states, painting the portraits of more successful farmers and tradesmen. When America had enough money and civilization to start buying art, Europe was already in the early stages of the modernist movement, and in 1913, when we were finally willing to invest some time and money in developing an art that expressed America's views, the Armory Show opened in New York City, and a schism quickly formed, and it never healed. Instead, in that same year, a new movie company started making movies by the name of Famous Players. They would be the first movie company to make money from the new fad of feature films. They would also be the first American movie company that's still in existence, although you know them by the name they changed to, Paramount Pictures. Like European art, American cinema became both an artistic vision and a major business. Hollywood became the world's biggest artist colony, and every filmmaker had to balance his or her artistic vision with the business of making money. But as large and influential as the American film business became, all those things I mentioned earlier are still true. No one saw the value in the public's joy in watching those early film strips, and at the beginning no one understood what future could be found in such scientific oddities as optical toys, magic lanterns, and light-sensitive chemicals. So on we start with the textbook stuff, and I really hope I can keep this short. Throughout my podcasts, there'll be time when I discuss science and history things. I'll try to make it simple, but to be honest, before we get to the first moving images on bed sheets, we're going to have to deal with a good amount of science. Sorry. All I can say is that I'll try to make it as short and simple as possible, but I'm not going to make any promises. Now, light-sensitive chemicals react to light. There are not a lot of them, and most of them involve the metallic element silver. Silver nitrate is pretty common in photography, but there are others that were collectively known as silver halides. If you need to know, halide is the chemical name for salt, so these chemicals are various versions of silver salts. To go any further would require me to dig into my Chemistry 101 knowledge. We have known about silver halides for a long time, and it goes back to the ancient world, where people who knew about them were primarily the silver miners. Another light-sensitive chemical is bitumen. It's an oily residue found near oil sand pits. While the silver compounds darkened when they were exposed to light, bitumen hardened. When chemistry came into its own in the 1700s, there were gentlemen scientists who used their money to build their own private laboratories to study the chemical makeup of the world around them. They also started sharing the information of their discoveries in letters, articles in newspapers, and in scientific journals. Among the things they studied were light-sensitive chemicals. One scientist, Johann Schultz, made the discovery that it was light, not heat, that turned the silver compounds dark. And it was a Swedish chemist named Carl Scheele who discovered that it was the light that was making it go dark by breaking down the compound. What was left was silver residue. This would be why film companies during the 1940s started wiping out their films. It was to collect all the loose silver and cash it in for the war effort. The first person to actually look for some kind of practical use for chemicals that darkened was Thomas Wedgwood. He was the sickly son of Josiah Wedgwood. Josiah was a famous maker of china in England, and he experimented with new ways to improve or modify his chinaware. Josiah and another gentleman were pretty much the company's R&D department, and in the 1770s, Wedgwood and Sons had taken on the task of creating a massive, innovative chinaware project for Catherine the Great, the Empress of Russia. This involved transferring thousands of landscape drawings of England onto plates, saucers, bowls, cups, serving dishes, and God knows what else. Josiah had a number of healthy sons who could work at the company and even later run it if they wanted to, but as Tom was sickly, there was less expectations on him. He had an interest in science, and in the late 1700s he started to fool around with applying silver compounds over leaves that were laid upon paper. Now, no one knows where he got the silver compounds, but it's assumed that he got them from his dad's company, and the leaf project actually sounds a bit like some of the silhouette china that Wedgwood and Sons were famous for. So who knows? Josiah was also a member of a number of scientific organizations, including the Royal Institution. It seemed that Thomas may have also attended, or his father may have simply introduced him to some of those scientists. Either way, he became friends with Humphrey Davy, England's most famous chemist at the time. Both he and Davy worked on projects with the chemicals. Unfortunately, Thomas Wedgwood died fairly early in 1805. What people like Thomas Wedgwood and Humphrey Davy were looking for could be called a practical use for light-sensitive chemicals. They even experimented with a camera obscura. It's hard to believe that a company like Wedgwood and Sons didn't experiment with some kind of shadow machine or camera obscura, since it would have benefited them greatly in making silhouettes. But this is where the experiments in chemistry start to lead towards photography. I think that now would be a good time to explain what a camera obscura is. In a nutshell, it's a camera. Not the smartphone camera, but the DSLR kind of camera you find in camera shops. It's another thing that goes back to the Greeks. Apparently, a sunlit outdoor image, if it's bright enough, can pass through a small hole in a wall in a building and be seen on the opposite wall, only the image is upside down. In its Greek form, it was simply an observation, and it might even have been devised as some kind of movable room of some sort. But in the 11th century, the Muslim scientist Al-Hazen created a portable version of this, only he placed a mirror in it so the image could be reflected upward. Now you have what is basically our modern camera, except for the film and the buttons. For a few centuries, this was used as a scientific toy or instrument among the scientists of Europe and Asia, but by around the 1400s it started falling into the hands of artists. They used it as a convenient way to avoid figuring out perspective. In the 1800s, camera obscura rooms could be found in Europe and even America. It was kind of like those scenic outlook telescopes you find, only the image was transferred to a mirrored table. Because the camera obscura was used both as an artist's tool and as a novelty, intelligent scientific men and women were well aware of it. That would have been how the Wedgwoods and Humphrey Davy probably knew of it. From here, Wedgwood's and Davy's idea kind of stalled, but ideas floated around the scientific atmosphere due to the amount of shared information that existed at that time. After all, many scientists see the world as beyond countries or religions. So the next person that went chasing after the idea of using light-sensitive chemicals to capture an image of reality was Niepce Niepce. Niepce Niepce was one of two brothers of a wealthy lawyer who owned an estate at Chalon-sur-Saône, which is about 50 miles north of Lyon, France. This area is going to figure heavily in the history of the early movies. The oldest brother was Claude, and Joseph was 2 years younger. The family calls Joseph by his middle name of Nicephore. When Nicephore was of age, he went into the army, while his older brother stayed at home and played the role of gentleman scientist. It's Nicephore who did the real work that led to photography, but the story is entangled with his brother's other attempts at inventing things. Claude's real claim to fame was devising an early internal combustion engine that he hoped to use as watercraft, kind of an outboard motor. It's the success of Claude's work that led Nicephore to quit the army and rejoin his brother. The French government under Napoleon issued a patent and was interested in the motor, but it required a powdered fuel made from the spores of some kind of moss. This stuff proved quite expensive to make. When it seemed that France would not spend the money to develop the fuel, Claude left for England, and Nicephore stayed home. What's interesting is that one of the products that Claude was using in his attempts to find a fuel for the engine was a liquefied version of bitumen. Nicephore started using it in his own project. That project was an attempt to transfer images of the real world onto a lithographic stone. I have no idea how long it took him to discover the camera obscura, but when he did, he started to use bitumen on metal plates and place them in the camera. So now we have a camera, but it's going to take another half-century to discover film. Nicephore struggled at finding a cheaper fuel for the engine and a viable chemical for capturing images on metal. Over in England, Claude was spending a lot of the family money attempting to wine and dine politicians and officials in order to get someone interested in his outboard motor. Eventually, his mental health suffered and he would soon die. Once Claude started to lose his grasp of reality, Nicephore went to visit him, and their father took off to find a suitable lens for the camera obscura. It seems that Nicephore's images were not clear enough, so the elder Niepce visited an optical shop in Paris run by Charles Chevalier. Monsieur Niepce told Monsieur Chevalier what his son had accomplished, and Chevalier mentioned that he had a customer named Louis Daguerre who used the camera obscura, and he'd let him know about Niepce's problem. Now, while everyone else in this story was a gentleman scientist, Daguerre was not. He was a trained artist. He grew up on the outskirts of Paris, and his first real job was as a set designer on the Parisian stage. In the 1820s, he started a panorama theater. Panoramas were an artistic novelty of the 19th century. They were massively large pieces of art that kind of crossed over to the stage. This made them a little like stage backdrops, and they even were presented in a way like a stage production. They could be rolled up and then unrolled in front of an audience, section by section, or they could be wrapped around the entire interior of a room with props placed in front of it, and a crowd standing in the middle admiring the view. These could be about historical events, famous battles, biblical scenes, large landscapes, vast cityscapes, and anything else you could paint on a large scale. Daguerre's paintings were of large castles, famous battles, and important cathedrals. He may have had some help in painting these, but he certainly was in charge of the work. That's because he shut down his business at the end of his season and spent the next several months planning and painting his next project. He called his exhibition business the Diorama and opened a second one in London. Sadly, the building burned down after an accident with a torch that was used as an effect in the show. When Daguerre found out that Niepce was attempting to capture images on metal panels, Daguerre wrote to him. This was in 1829. What followed was a cat-and-mouse game involving an inventor who didn't want to reveal his secrets and an artist who understood the camera obscura. While the two men soon agreed to a partnership, it wouldn't be until 1831 that Niepce let Daguerre in on his secret. 2 years later, Niepce died. Nicéphore's work would now pass to his son Isidore. Isidore lacked any knowledge or interest in the discovery of the process of photography, and his only concern was rescuing the financial situation of the family's estate. He was uneasy about the mounting costs of the photography project, but he had become Daguerre's main contact with the Niepce estate. So by the end of the 1830s, 2 of the 3 Frenchmen who were trying to capture images of reality were now dead. Daguerre was the only one left alive, and he had little knowledge of chemistry. From now on, he'd have to do his own research and depend upon what he could learn from others. He knew how to capture images on metal plates using the bitumen process, and he could even clean the images. But he couldn't speed up the drying process, and it'd take him 6 years to figure out how to do it. At the same time, another person became involved in the development of photography, a man totally unknown to Louis Daguerre. His name was Henry Fox Talbot, the only son of a British lady, the daughter of the 2nd Earl of Ilchester. Henry was shy and retiring, very inclined to mathematics and the sciences, and very much dominated by his strong-willed mother. It was through her insistence that he was elected to the House of Commons to represent Wiltshire County. The position was a family obligation. He may not have liked it, but for all his reclusiveness, Henry was not a man to ignore an obligation. Talbot wrote a number of papers on mathematics and scientific subjects, but he had little interest in chemistry. He also had no interest in art or the development of photography until after Nicéphore died. What pushed him into the science of photography was his marriage to Constance Mundy. In particular, it was their honeymoon in Italy. During their stay at Lake Como in northern Italy, Talbot was attempting to draw the shoreline with a camera lucida. This mechanical oddity gives a person the ability to draw an object with the help of a mirror, but you have to keep your head still to get a decent drawing. Talbot couldn't master the novelty and decided to create a machine that could capture the image. Unlike the Niepces or Daguerre, Talbot had many scientific connections and a good education in the sciences. He spent the next 2 years developing his photographic process. As he was working with silver nitrate rather than bitumen, the brighter part of his images turned dark rather than staying light. Scheele had predicted this result 60 years earlier. This result would lead to Talbot creating negatives instead of positives, the reverse of what Daguerre and Niepce had done. The consequences of his discovery meant that you could make multiple positives from one negative. Talbot also solved the issue of the continual darkening of his images by developing a fixative. In the end, what Nicéphore Niepce had created was a positive image on metal. These images are quite beautiful, and once they were revealed to the world, they would turn photography into a worldwide craze. But Talbot's process, which would come out later, gave the world something else: the ability to reproduce a photographic image. He could develop positives from his negative and even hand them out to his friends. Once he truly created what would become modern photography, Talbot put it all aside to tend to other things. Daguerre knew nothing about Talbot and his work, and Talbot knew nothing about Daguerre and Niepce's work. So at around the same time that Talbot started to investigate the photographic process, Daguerre continued in his struggle to find a faster way to dry his bitumen panels, and eventually he changed the process. Instead of just coating a metal plate, he started to first chemically treat them before coating them with bitumen. In this new process, he used mercury vapors. At the time, no one was aware of the damaging ramifications of using some of these chemicals, but by luck, in the 1850s a replacement was already being used for heated mercury. In early 1839, Daguerre started negotiating a contract with the government of France for the ownership of the patent of the daguerreotype. France would give a lifetime pension to Daguerre in exchange for allowing all of France to make daguerreotypes. Isidore, as Nicéphore's heir, also received a pension, although it was of a lesser amount than Daguerre's. There were two reasons for the pension. The first was the financial problems that both Niepce and Daguerre faced. The second was the ease with which others could copy the process. France had a policy of issuing pensions for national reasons, and Daguerre's donation of his patent seemed to fit the bill. Allowing France to own the rights which every citizen could use turned the country absolutely, photographically mad. News of the daguerreotype spread quickly, and soon it was being copied around the world. America learned the news about Daguerre's discovery fairly quickly. Astronomer John Herschel coined a new word, photography, and it too quickly found its way into the news. Talbot was shocked by Daguerre's announcement of his photographic accomplishment, as well as the worldwide celebrity that the Frenchman had suddenly earned. John's mother demanded that he gather together every bit of proof that he had to claim prior discovery, but it wasn't that simple. He had his notes and his photographs, but as his process was different from Daguerre's, there were doubts about its viability. To make matters worse, the daguerreotype had swept France up in its arms, and the concept was spreading across Europe, England, and America. There was little chance that Talbot could convince the rest of the world of the importance of his discoveries, and to those who listened, he was considered a crank. American inventor Samuel Finley Breeze Morse was in Paris at that time. Morse was an American painter of some renown and had recently invented the telegraph along with the Morse code. He had spent considerable time lobbying the United States government for support in developing a continental communications system. The best he got was continued delays. Finally, he left for France, a country much more interested in his telegraphic system, although in the end they would also balk on his proposals. But while he was in Paris, he witnessed the craze for photography taking over the city, and before he left, he learned the process from Daguerre and purchased the chemicals and materials needed to take daguerreotypes. Once he was back in America at the end of 1839, Morse started teaching others the photographic process. He also discovered that a gentleman in New York City by the name of M.D. Van Loan was already offering photographs in the daguerreotype manner. Soon, students of Morse were setting up shops, and in early 1841, a photographer was taking daguerreotypes of the members of the House of Representatives and the Senate, as well as President Harris and Vice President Tyler. In England, Talbot tried to control the growing daguerreotype business by bringing in all sorts of legal trickery. Unfortunately, as he was charging an arm and a leg for his own photographic process, he was hindering the growth of photography in Britain. By the early 1850s, another photographic process seemed to relegate both Daguerre's and Talbot's process to the wastebasket of history. This process was developed by a British artist named Frederick Archer and was known as the wet plate process. It involved glass plates coated with a syrupy mixture of nitrocellulose, alcohol, and ether, a concoction known as collodion. The wet plate method required the dipping of a square glass plate into the collodion mixture and then sprinkling it with silver halide just before it was to be used. Archer, like Daguerre, made his process public. Unfortunately, no government gave him a financial reward for his generosity, and he soon died broke. By the 1870s, Archer's process would again be replaced by another photographic system, this one called dry plate. America soon had photographic shops and photographers everywhere. They set up shops in the big cities, and people placed their heads in metal holders in order to stay still for the photograph. They traveled by cart and by train to every small town imaginable. Photographers were traveling into uncharted territories, following explorers into canyons, jungles, and up into the mountains. They followed the American and Confederate armies during the Civil War, photographing army life, battles, and the fields full of dead. Eventually, one eccentric Brit would receive training in photography and return to his new home in San Francisco, where he met America's greatest millionaire at that time and photographed his horses while they ran. But that's a story for next time. So thanks for listening.